Okay, we're now up to Module 8 in Community Justice Innovation, and this week we're looking at the application of those restorative justice ideas beyond the criminal justice system. And I mean, yes, this is part of a criminology course, but one of the strengths, and I guess can be the weaknesses of criminology, is that it looks at the problem of crime in a broad range of social contexts. And a whole lot of different influences that impact on the problem of crime. So whereas the early criminologists were very much, what was the criminal brain? Was the problem with the idleness of the poor that turned them to crime? As soon as we introduced sociology to criminology, we got this sense of understanding that a broad range of social problems all interact in complicated ways. We've got health, we've got education, we've got poverty, we've got addiction, we've got crime, and everything kind of interacts with each other. So because of that, it's not a surprise that we have tried to use the ideas from restorative justice that have been used and applied in the criminal justice system in various other contexts. So what we're going to look at this week, we're going to look at schools. We are going to look at child protection and the family court. We're going to look at environmental, and we're going to look at this concept of a restorative city and what that actually means. So we're just going to touch on these ideas, and I think they're important for us, not just as a way of seeing the set of skills in restorative justice having broader application, but also seeing the way in which these different systems interact with each other. And I mean, the first one we're going to look at is schools, and there is definite connections between education and criminality. Not that I would argue, or anyone should argue, that the schools are causing crime, but the problems, the same social pressures, social problems that are producing misconduct in school are the same ones, quite usually, that then go on to push people in the direction of a criminal career, create criminality. So it's an easy way, I guess, to say, well, these are the bad schools, and the bad schools produce bad kids who become criminals. That's overly simplistic. But we look at the impact of those things: poverty, poor health, poor funding of education. You get this sort of perfect storm around schools, which is why schools have always been a focus of criminology in different ways, of a site of intervention and a site of improvement. And it's one of those things that's been around so long, you'd think we would get the message by now when we devote more resources to schooling if we were serious about avoiding criminality. But in fact, we seem to be stripping assets and resources away from schooling. We seem to be more and more talking about privatising schooling and saying, people who can pay for private schools, and everyone else just goes into these mass ill-funded classrooms. So, this approach would appall someone in the Victorian era, because even then they thought it was for different reasons, but even then they identified school as being a major locus for criminality. And today it's just like, user pays. And if you can afford, you can pay for a good school, and if you can't, you might as well just, go straight to prison, do not pass go. So the materials in the notes this week we're going to look at from Morrison talks about introducing restorative justice to schools, not just as a dispute resolution mechanism. And I think this is what's most interesting about this case example, is that it's what Morrison calls a whole school approach, and it's ambitious, and it's something we haven't even really tried with criminal restorative justice. But it's this idea that there are multiple layers to creating a culture in which restorative justice can operate, that just creating a discipline model that's based on criminal law restorative justice isn't enough. You need to embed this across multiple levels. So he says there's 3 levels to this. The first is the primary level, is the creation of a restorative environment. It's creating a culture within the school that lives by the principles of restorative justice. And that's for everyone. That's for the kids, the teachers, the administrators, and everyone else. And I guess this is the point at which this plan falls down in 90% of the cases, is while everyone wants better, more better behaved kids and better discipline in the school, actually getting wider substantive cultural change and actually getting the people in charge to embrace that change and be part of that change is generally a lot more difficult. So embracing that philosophy of restorative justice means thinking more on that level of valuing relationships, understanding the mutuality in relationships, and in a way it is going to involve stepping away a little from the hierarchical model, that hierarchical power model where you say, we're the teachers, we're in charge, you do what you've got to do, you've got to do your classwork and you do it because we tell you to do it. That's a culture that doesn't embrace the importance of those relationships in restorative justice. So that's that first level, and that's the hardest level, is changing a culture and changing the way something's organised. The second level that Morrison talks about is, or the secondary level, is targeting specific individuals and groups. Focusing on specific behaviours that disrupt harmony and social relationships in the classroom, hallways and playgrounds. So this is not waiting till something gets to the point where there's bullying or vandalism or truancy or assault or bad behaviour or any of those things. It's looking at the kinds of specific conflicts that are creating trouble and trying to address those, and focusing on, is bullying a problem? Because there seem to be a lot of bullying going on. Well, where is that coming from? What is it about? Is it bullying the kids, the haves against the have-nots? Is it the bullying, the nerds bullying the jocks, or whatever? And again, at a structural level, looking at those causes and trying to address those causes. And yes, it might be a specific individual. It's, John from Form 2A, always creating problems, but looking at it in terms of the structural issues that John is located in, that others are also going to be located in. That you're not just fixing it for that one person, you're using that one person as a way of identifying what those deeper problems are. And the third level is the intensive of use of restorative justice to address specific harms and specific harmful behaviour. So this is the most like the normal criminal justice approach. So we've got this idea that we have this dispute resolution approach, as we do, in the courts, but we've got a level above that where we look at trying to anticipate those disputes and the problems in your culture that lead to those disputes, and then a level above all of that, which is about looking at the whole culture and how the whole culture can be modified in a way that it can improve those other two levels. Now, we don't do that with criminal justice, restorative justice. We very rarely, and we'll come back to this point in a moment, but we very rarely look at points of intervention beyond the individual offenders and victims. And I think Morrison's model of restorative justice in schools gives us a reason why we're not more successful. I mean, we're still reasonably successful, as we've seen in the last few modules, in terms of restorative justice procedures. But we are in some ways handicapped by the fact that it exists in a culture that still creates inequality, creates structures of oppression, creates structures of violence, and then at the top level above that, we're living in a culture that promotes competition, that promotes getting ahead at the expense of other people. And we're never ever going to really make much of a difference unless we change our entire culture to be kind of nicer to one another. Because otherwise we're sending mixed messages. We're saying, to the individual who assaults someone in a car park on Friday night, we're saying we don't tolerate that kind of behaviour. But of course the powerful can get away with all sorts of systemic violence and systemic force and oppression, because that's okay, because our system legitimises that. So before I get into a big political rant about all of this, I think that the focusing on schools is a good way of thinking about how, in what ways, large and small, can we try and institute a social change to our social system where basically people are just kinder to one another, that we don't reward bullying, we don't reward bad behaviour, and you know, it goes all the way to the top. Now, two of the next two examples, I guess, just different case studies of where situations where restorative justice processes and principles have been used. One is child protection, not surprisingly, and a connected issue to that is the family court in Australia. So child protection, we're talking fairly much across the board internationally, that using conferencing and getting everyone together and focusing on the needs of children first is a sound way of approaching the situation, rather than having social services come in and impose a decision from above. In Australia, on the other hand, we have this kind of embedded in our family law system through compulsory mediation, and I've been down that track plenty of times and explained why I think that's a bad idea. But I think there's one area where it can be a lot more successful, in that rather than having court orders for custody, that you actually have a negotiated set of custody arrangements. And we were kind of doing that already even before we had court annex mediation. Our family court in the 1980s did move much more towards a reconciliation approach and an idea of having joint custody as the standard, rather than one person gets custody and the other person has to pay support. The idea of a shared custody arrangement was already fairly common, unless there was a really strong reason why one parent shouldn't have custody of children, such as being a danger to the children. So our family court system had been moving in that restorative reconciliation negotiated approach. I do think that the compulsory mediation has weakened that, because what I think it does is it makes, if you're forcing everyone into that negotiated arrangement, then the relationship with what happens with children is just another set of playing pieces in the overall negotiation game. And you start sort of playing one off against the other. It's like, well, we've got the property dispute and we've got the dispute over children, and they all become part of this overall game of who wins the negotiation. Mixed feelings on this one. I think a restorative justice themed approach is the most appropriate for anything involving children's well-being and welfare. But I also think that, as in many other things, the compulsory mediation part of family law in Australia has messed the whole thing up for everyone, and weakened the things that already were good. Now, the next one, we're going for time. Another one I wanted to mention was environmental harm. This is one that's tricky for a number of reasons. One is the who's the victim situation. Quite often, if you've got environmental harm, there's sort of everyone and no one is the victim. So it doesn't work like a conventional legal case where one person brings action against the person who harmed them. And we have some modification where we do allow class actions, because then all the people who live off the creek that got poisoned can sue the company that poisoned the creek. But again, that's also sort of problematic, because the harms are usually they're literally downstream harms. They're literally and metaphorically these downstream problems that are going to affect lots of other people further down the track, and they're going to do things like kill wildlife. Who gets to take action on behalf of the dead wildlife? who is actually a victim of the loss of wildlife. All kind of problematic issues legally, and that carries through, I think, to the idea of using restorative justice here. Now, if a company is sincerely the right word, but is legitimately engaged with this process, they've done something wrong, they've admitted that they've done the wrong thing, and they're committed to cleaning it up, then a restorative process can work in terms of hearing from everyone's who's harmed and negotiating an outcome. But there is that massive power imbalance between a corporation, who's usually heavily lawyered up, and a neighbourhood and community group. So this is an area where I don't know of any example, but a lot of people use it as an example when they say, restorative justice is great for blah 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 blah, and I'll just rattle off environmental issues, but I've not really seen any situation where it has been legitimately all that useful. And it's largely because corporations aren't people. You can't negotiate with a corporation in any kind of fair power relationship. All right, and the last example I want to look at before we close for today is the idea of a restorative city. And this is, I guess, taking the material that Morrison talked about in terms of schools and saying, well, what do we do in terms of trying to transform our urban environments to ones that are more supportive of this? How do we build stronger communities? How do we build this idea of people, being able to depend more on their neighbours? And, I'm really lucky where I live, where I've got neighbours on sort of next to me and across the street who are really great people, who I know that if I got into trouble and needed some help, they'd be right in there to help me. When the storms happened a couple of years ago and my tree fell over 3 houses in that direction and knocked out everyone's power, I was doing what I could to try and help them out with, getting food to them and getting stuff into refrigerators and things, because I felt awful that my large and ancient gum tree had done that sort of harm. But I also acknowledge that that's largely a matter of chance. It's largely a matter of just not only getting in the right relationship, the right locations with those people, but also having the opportunity to develop those relationships. And I know with both those neighbours, that's been largely accidental. It's been bumping into people and going, hi, you live across the road, hello, whatever, what do you do? And then when there's something like COVID comes up, checking in with people and seeing how they go. So not everyone has access to that. So the question is, how do we develop social structures, urban structures that cultivate those relationships? There's the old saying, that good fences make good neighbours, but good fences can also stop you knowing your neighbours at all. So it's a real mixed bag. Anything that tries to force people to be community-minded is destined to be terrible. Telling everyone they have to go to, community days down at the local community centre, you can imagine how happy most of us would be about that. And a lot of the attempts to do this kind of thing end up in that sort of, when you look at the ways that manufactured communities, like gated communities, try and do this, it ends up being really repressive. John Oliver did a great piece, it was quite a while ago now, but it's still there on YouTube, around gated communities and the kind of rules they had, and the big furor about an old man who had a bench that wasn't authorised under the agreement of the gated community, that he used to like to sit in the sun in his bench in his front yard, and how the community were trying to get him to forcibly force him to remove his bench because it was an eyesore. So you end up with this kind of ridiculous stuff where you go the wrong way in trying to create community in this sort of conformity rather than community. And rather than looking at what people need, i.e. old guy really likes to sit in the sun in the mornings and his needs are for this bench, to the it looks different to everyone's houses and people are worried it'll bring down their property values, which is not really all that based on welfare and restoration. So a few cities have tried to implement this philosophy. In Australia, Canberra and Newcastle have tried to work on this, so that's sort of interesting. It's not gotten anywhere in a big way. What I think is an interesting counterexample is the way in which the UK has moved in the opposite direction, and they've moved towards punitive surveillance cities. So the introduction of cameras across the UK, and I think London is the most surveilled space on the planet in terms of the number of cameras and amount of surveillance that's going on. The creation of this idea of no-go zones, where you can't go into this area because it's a no-go zone. The sort of urban policies that they've implemented for decades in the UK, I think, have led to the kind of violence we've seen this year. I think there's directly led because they have been focused on dismantling this idea of community, dismantling this idea of interrelationships in society, creating people locked in their own spaces. So I don't have great examples of the contrary. It's interesting that people are trying to create these sort of restorative spaces and these restorative cultures. And, you do see things, and you've also got to get these things filtered through the media. And the media loves murders and horrible, horrific things happening. And most of the nice things people do for each other isn't really newsworthy, or it's dealt with in this kind of patronising, oh, isn't it lovely? Mrs. Smith's makes crochets coats for poor people's dogs or something. So our media is driven by conflict, is driven by violence and unfairness. So it is very hard to find a location where we can find and popularise this. I've seen some stuff interesting in terms of rural locations in the last 12 months, actually, where, rural communities have pulled together and managed to get the school reopened and, managed to try and build something in these small towns. And I think that's probably a clearer example than anything that we see in urban spaces. But I think this is something to keep our eye on and to look at this space and to think about, like, we can produce the best victim offender mediation programs in the world, but it's always coming too late. That we need to learn from that process and try and develop something that is stronger and more solid on a community level. All right, we'll talk about this more in the workshop as usual.